I've been having an ongoing series around real estate, the pros and cons of off-plan models in the country. Time now to get into a weekly segment, BizChat. Quite an exciting time indeed. Well, we are now joined by Ken Gishinga, Chief Economist at Mentore Economics, and Wahoro Ndoho, the MD at Sandbox Capital, and Odhiambo Ramogi from LM Capital. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Always a pleasure having you on the program. And today's focus really comes just as Kenyans continue to brace with the high cost of living. We are seeing a couple of items, the prices are going up. The recent one being milk prices. They've shot up to as high as 58 shillings. We understand cement prices have also rose significantly, and fertilizer, which is a very basic commodity to many farmers in the country. I just want to get your immediate reactions to this. What are the implications on the common man, Gishinga?
I think you're absolutely right, Abi. The cost of living has been going up. There was that Twitter trend, lower food prices, that was trending for 4 days in a row about 2 weeks ago. I think this is a function of both international factors and domestic factors. But to simply answer your question, the impact is it's getting harder for the Kenyan to get by.
And for you, Wahoro, what does this translate to when Kenyans are unable to afford a packet of milk?
Well, I suppose it gives let's not forget this has been part of a long-term trend. I mean, it didn't start tomorrow, it didn't start yesterday. That it's got to a place where there's a time we used to talk about exogenous factors, other things that outside the economic model, like get into space and make things even harder. I think we can say that it's been true for the last 7 years, 8 years, that we've had an increasingly dire situation around affordability, living standards, so to speak. And so this, to me, what worries me is that is this the tip of that, we are at a tipping point in terms of the cost of living for the average Kenyan. And to that extent, the fact that we have a war in Ukraine, the fact that alone has created a whole new series of pressures around our economic model, and on top of that, we have an election ahead of us. They all sort of culminate to a very sensitive time. And it's true that we have a challenge, but the question is, we've spoken about this for so long. What is the solution? And are there solutions to this? And the extent to which that this is a critical year of electioneering, of choosing our next generation of leaders, how are we going to do it differently?
All right. Yeah. I don't know if we have Ramogi online. Ramogi, if you can hear me, just want to also get your quick assessment. What are the implications to the common man and woman?
Thank you. Absolutely. I agree with my colleagues that, one, the cost of living is high. It has been the case for a very long time. We've seen inflation pushing up, even though the reports from a central bank towards telling us that the inflation has remained steady over the years. And I agree this is part of the international and local. Moving forward, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to ensure that we come out of this. I don't think that this will to do in the next few months. The cost of fuel will continue to be high because of the war in Ukraine, and the high cost of wheat will also continue to be high, and this will continue to be the case. What this means to the local man or normal wananchi, as you put it, it means more and lesser disposable income that can be used, that can be used for development, or that can be used for growth. It means then that we probably ourselves in cyclical poverty for a while now.
Right. And Gishinga, so what alternatives do we have? Because we are literally at a very interesting point in time, because as Wahoro says, we are staring at an election. We are still battling with drought in some parts of the country, and food production has nearly not been at its optimum. Of course, the various authorities are indicating that the rains might kick in the second week of April or third week of April. But in the interim, what alternatives do we have? Because at the end of the day, if people cannot afford the basic commodities, they are meant to make do with what's available.
Well, the government has tried to roll out some subsidies on fuel, on fertilizer, but that's a temporary situation because, as Wahoro said, you don't want to go into an elections when prices are extremely high. You know, a 400-gram loaf of bread it was about 55 shillings. It might go up to 60 to 67. So I think they could have a temporary subsidy program, but I think the longer-term strategy has to be, how do we get this country into production? Because it does not make sense that we import 80% of our wheat. We need to be able to have local capacity. We need to have, you know, Winston Churchill used to say, diversity is the key anchor of security. We need to have, yes, we need to import some foods, but we need to get this country back into food production.
And how do we get it there? Because we are deeply in debt. At the same time, we are staring at a budget reading coming up in April. What's in your wish list if you were to have a one-on-one with the attorney?
Well, I would say pretty much we need to look at that fertilizer subsidy because it's one of the key elements that makes our cost of food very high. We need to think of, you know, fertilizer from an organic perspective. We do import quite a bit from Russia. But I think from a broader perspective is, can we be able to provide some tax exemptions on the key inputs, temporary tax exemptions? I think if we can do that, we can be able to get a bit more farmers into production. All right.
And Gishinga, just still staying with you, the other day I saw a photo of you in Kibanda, or as we call it, pale kwa mama pima.
Right.
And clearly when we are unable to afford just a decent meal, a balanced meal, what does this do to households? Because we are literally at a precipice.
No, yeah, you know, if we used to say that we are on the edge, but I feel like a lot of Kenyans are beyond the edge. That particular episode in which I actually interviewed one mandazi maker, and he said the cost of cooking oil has gone up, the cost of LPG has gone up. So in as much as he's told that the economy has been growing for about 5% the last decade, it's not been trickling down to him. So I think it's time we start reviewing our economics, not just from the GDP perspective, but from cost of living and employability. I think the unemployment levels have significantly gone up, particularly post-COVID, and it's time we start measuring what are our unemployment levels like in the States every month.
All right. And Wahoro, what needs to happen between now and the elections to stimulate economic activity, especially with programs that will put money directly in the hands of Kenyans?
Oh my goodness, there's three things in my opinion. First is you have to break up all cartels. You go into any sector of the economy, there's a cartel.
But I thought the cartels were broken
who look like me, who make all the money, and the rest is left to, Mwananchi is left with the scraps of that particular sector. You cannot have an economy. I always say this about Africa. Africa is the only continent on earth that doesn't have three things. It doesn't have its own military industrial complex, it doesn't have its own food security system, and it doesn't have its own monetary system. And as long as you don't have, if you have no clarity in those three in terms of some sort of independence, if you're always going to be importing from Ukraine or some other godforsaken country, there's no reason why 60 years after independence we are not food secure. There's no reason why Africa, with 60% of the world's arable land, remaining arable land, in other words, land that has not been spoiled by over-farming, by too much fertilizer, we have the prime property on earth. It makes no sense how 60 years now we're talking about farming, you're talking about being food insecure. So unless you move it so that it's not just the big boys, because even a debate about fertilizer, by the way, it will be about the big boys, because fertilizers too, there's organic and inorganic fertilizer. Inorganic fertilizer is what drives commercial farming. And that's because the inorganic fertilizer goes directly, it's applied, it's taken up immediately by plants. Inorganic, organic is basically the one that's manure and what have you. That takes time because it has to decompose. We have to depend on inorganic, but we don't produce it ourselves. That doesn't make sense. 60 years after independence, we should be exporting to the rest of the world and Africa.
Okay.
And to me, until you start there, first is break the cartel. Secondly, let's produce some of these things ourselves in terms of the underlying systems. Then we can talk about food security.
And Ramogi, if you're still on the line, what would be your antidote of fixing this in this very uncertain times for the economy?
Production. Let me weigh in on the politics first. On a very shrewd way, I think I like the happenings, inspiring conversations before the elections. It's inspiring voters' attitudes, voters' feelings into how they are going to vote. Because previously we voted based on tribe, we voted based on handouts, and I pray that this high cost of living will inform the voters' decision this time around, so that they vote with their needs in mind and vote responsible leaders, not necessarily leaders from their tribes or leaders with hefty handouts. But let's go into the real issue, which is production. There was a time we were thinking of going into producing the fertilizers locally, and I think there was a company that was established, a factory that was established in Eldoret to produce fertilizer. I don't know how that went, but it is clear that we need a second and maybe a third fertilizer producing factory in Kenya, because the importation is also pushing prices upwards. And it's not just an issue of fertilizer, it's an issue of fertilizer, it's an issue of land tenure, it's an issue of climate smart agriculture or technologies, it's an issue of general policy and investment into agriculture. And it's not just wheat, it's everywhere. It's in maize, it's in other produce as well. And so we must really change our attitude towards agriculture, because if we are to have a strong economic foundation, it must be based on good agro production.
Okay. Thank you for your insights there, Odhiambo Ramogi, joining us virtually, and also to my other panelists, Ken Gishinga, Horondoho. I know our time is far much spent and there's a lot to still cover ground, and we appreciate your company this Friday and looking sharp as always. Have a lovely weekend ahead, gentlemen. But for us, we want to go on a quick commercial break. We still have much more on the other side of the break. Stay with us.